Good evening, I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philogeny Center, and welcome to Poetry and Microgenesis. Now, before we begin this evening's, I don't know what to call it, it's between a discussion and a talk, so it's kind of a new form. I want to call your attention to the art on the walls. A lot of people walk into Philogenies and they think that what they're seeing or they pay no attention to it is decorative, but indeed it is not. This is a show that's been curated by Holly Cohen and Adam Ludwig, and it's called The Aesthetics of Mathematics. And it is in conjunction with our math series, Math and Religion and Math and Beauty. This Saturday is Math and Beauty, and you should really come to it because these math series have been great, and they're funded by the Templeton Foundation, and we're grateful to them for doing that for us. And then on Sunday, we have the inventions of Bob Dylan with two distinguished authors and essayists, Christopher Ricks and Princeton historian Sean Willens. So this, in essence, is a typical kind of, it epitomizes Philogenies this weekend because we have math on a hybrid of math, albeit, on Saturday, and then on Sunday we have a program which is totally classifiable in the humanities area, but all on the same weekend. Then the following Tuesday, a very distinguished scholar, who both of you know, Daniel Mendelsohn, is coming to talk about C.P. Cavafy. We're very excited about that, as we were about the two of you. And I just want to say that Philogenies has recently been the proud recipient of 2 awards from the New York State Council on the Arts in music and in poetry. We've received, as many of you know, a grant from Bloomberg LP. We've received a grant from Templeton for our math series, as I said before, and from the Department of Cultural Affairs and from the Elsie Wunsch Foundation most recently. So we've been getting grants from some foundations, but we are struggling to survive, and we need your help. So look on the site, there's PayPal on the site. If you can make contributions, it keeps us alive. Every contribution keeps us alive. But the way we're taking it is kind of a day at a time type prospect. We hope to make it through December, certainly through December 31st, and we want to go on into next year. If we can get a certain amount of donations, then that enables me to go and apply for more grants, and that's really what's happening. And now I give you Poetry and Microgenesis, and our 2 distinguished guests are going to introduce themselves, speak, and even talk.
Okay.
Amongst each other.
First, Jason.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I think I've been elected to go first, and so hello, everyone. Being here, I haven't been here in a while, and it reminds me a little bit of the story about the professor who talked way over his time, an hour too long, and finally he stood up and he said to the audience that he apologized for going on so long, but he said there was no clock in the room. And somebody in the audience said, yes, but there is a calendar. So I do have a tendency to just talk and talk, so kick me if I go over my time. I'm supposed to say a word or two about myself. I'm kind of a lapsed neurologist, which I guess in this house is not such a terrible thing. I started life as actually a behavioral neurologist. I had my training in Boston with Norm Geschwin, and then studied in various labs in Europe. With Lori in Moscow and other places. Can you hear me? Yeah, I've had good opportunities to study when I was a young man, and retired recently as a clinical professor at NYU, where I had maybe I should talk from here, should I? Is that better?
It's not going to make a difference.
Oh. Retired recently as a professor from NYU, and my writing began in the field of aphasia. I spent about 10 years working on that problem, language in the brain. Then developed a model of language in the brain, which it seemed to me was applicable to problems of perception, to action, to memory, to feeling, to a whole variety of cognitive domains, a kind of Ur model or bow plan, so to say, of the mind-brain. Spent about 10 years in neuropsychology. And then, to the dismay of my colleagues in psychiatry and neurology, sort of veered into philosophy of mind, and particularly process philosophy and problems of time, change, the nature of process, the nature of the mental state, duration, and so on. And so I guess my philosophical heroes would be people like William James and Whitehead and Bergson and people of that sort. I think one of the more important years of my training I spent with George Miller, a year at Rockefeller University, and it was an important year for me because it was a birth of cognitive science. It sort of started there, actually. And this, for me, was a kind of culmination of a trend that began in my early studies with localization of function. The history of neuropsychology and aphasia is localizing language in the brain and then other functions. The Chomskyan approach, which was a kind of modularity in localizing grammatical intuitions and so on in the frontal lobe and the like. And then with cognitive science, the almost mosaicist approach to cognition, and some of you see these articles on fMR, localization of love or whatever, the moral sense here or there in the brain, and the reduction of various aspects of thought or perception to more and more local areas in the brain, and then even to the genome, and eliminating mind. So my approach is very different from that. The whole effort has been to develop a process way of thinking about the actualization of a mental state. And I think at the end of 30 or 35 years of work in the field, I suppose what I could say about the theory, and I would urge you to give it take a look at it, because I think it's the only theory in neuropsychology that has the potential to map to psychoanalytic theory. I think particularly the early Freud, the Freud of the metapsychology, and the topographic theory and so on, not the later Freud, where it becomes a little too developed for kind of neurological mapping. Basically, microgenesis is a translation of a German term which refers to, first of all, its connection to phylogenesis and ontogenesis. So what happens in millions of years, and then in the maturational or lifespan cycle, happens in a fraction of a second, 50 or 100 milliseconds, in the momentary development of a mental state. So the words that are coming out of my mouth, the objects around me in the room, all have behind them an implicit series of phases through which they unfold. I think the proper metaphor for a process theory is not a river, the Heraclitean river, but a fountain that pours out form and then it decays or actually is incompletely revived in the next spray, leading from the source to the surface, iterated over and over and over again. So I think this metaphor, you might want to keep that in mind as we go into the theory a little bit. I can't collapse 35 years of work into 20 minutes, but I just want to give you kind of the shape of the theory and particularly how it may apply to poetry. Just take the problem of object perception. The theory flips conventional theory upside down. Instead of sensations being assembled into objects by different components in the brain, there's an endogenous process of object formation leading from the core in the archaic evolutionary systems of the brainstem, hypothalamus, through archaic limbic system, then more recent limbic structures, to neocortex, and finally to the primary cortex, where a object develops first through a phase of the core self, drive representations, not exactly as Freud used the term, but something like a drive-like feeling and the categories of drive behavior, to the conscious self, and from the conscious self through a phase of imagery and dream and hallucination, if you will, and finally to the objects of the world, so that the room around me is like the skin of my mind. It's the edge, it's the final edge, the leading edge of this whole process, like the froth of the fountain, that the room is really the end point of the mental state, and that it's iterated in overlapping waves. William James spoke of, or wrote of, pulses of cognitive consciousness. He thought the mental state was overlapping waves, and I would agree with that. Whitehead wrote of drops of experience, and he worked with James, and he had the same idea in mind. In this process of going from depth to surface, you go from wholes to parts. You go from a memory-like experience to a perception-like experience. Sensation is extrinsic to the object development. This is an important feature, and this is, I've had a lot of battle scars for arguing this theory over the years with various groups who think of sensation as the building blocks for, or ingredients of perceptions. There you have, first you have feature detection at 2D, then 3D, then mapping to memory, and so on. This way of thinking has a kind of Gestalt formation-like approach, where you have a whole or contextual construct in the earliest phases that develops through conceptual feelings, from drive-like to intentional feelings, then through an image space and out into the world, with sensation acting to sculpt or trim or parse or restrain or constrain the object development. So this is really an evolutionary theory where sensation plays a role of the environment in eliminating unfit form. Just as in evolution, the environment sculpts away or trims away the exuberant development of form so that only the fittest survive. In the microgenesis of an act of cognition, an act of perception, an action, a thought, sensation sculpts away irrelevant data, so to say. So the object that develops, the object before me, the world before me, is the only one that could develop in a healthy brain. And it's a perfect match with the physically real world out there, which we can't see. Everything's going on in our brain. It's all inside my head. Now, we have the deception of a very sharp break between the mind and the head and the world out there. We know from pathology that this is a deception. Those of you who've studied schizophrenics, and I've certainly worked with them, you know, about intermediate phases where thoughts become objects and objects become thought-like and so on. So we know from neuropsychological cases, we also know that there's intermediate phases. So I think there's a continuous sheet of mind from the core in the brain to the surface, the neocortical surface in the world, dream representing an intermediate phase that is developing along endogenous lines, but the substrate of the dream is constrained, or that segment of the process is constrained by sensation to realize true objects, so to say. In this process, you're going from wholes to parts, and each part serves as a whole for another whole part transformation. I think that the whole part transition is the E equals MC square of the mind-brain. And these are parts that are not constituents of wholes, and wholes that are not sums of parts. These are qualitative. Some people have written about my theory as a fractal theory, but fractal theory are self-similar replications. These are not self-similar. There is a qualitative transition, and this is a cascade of whole part transitions. In other words, you have the same mechanism, so to say, applied at successive phases rather than multiple mechanisms at different areas in the brain. You're going from ground to figure, you're going from context to item, frame to content. There are various ways of looking at this. People have written about differentiation, individuation, specification, parcellation. They're all getting at the same idea of the whole, going from unity to diversity instead of the diversity combining to unity. So it just flips everything upside down. And this is why it's been very difficult to people understand what I think is a fairly simple theory, although there's a mountain of clinical data that support it that was put together over the years. And one of the things that I would emphasize about the theory is that you also go from unconscious to conscious over qualitative stages. So that unlike Freud's idea, his later ideas of traces as being relatively immutable, and a kind of flashlight theory of consciousness, where consciousness alights on the trace and illuminates it, it becomes conscious. So the only difference between unconscious and conscious is that it's cathected by attention, so to say. At least that's my reading of it. Some of you may have different ways of thinking about it. Here there's a continuous transition. I think the psychoanalysts or psychiatrists who are most relevant are people like David Rappaport or Paul Schilder or James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, in his early work. You also go over a series of rhythmic layers, and this is relevant, I think, to poetry that maybe Stephen will touch on. In the development of an action, you go from a core breath group or tonal rhythm that is linked to the respiratory rhythm, because you have to program the expiration for the sentence that you're going to produce. And so you go from like a fundamental frequency to a harmonic, which you could say is a prosodic or intonational contour of the utterance, and then to the fine temporal program of the speech sounds. So you're going from one frequency to another frequency, and I think it's a series of vibratory kinetic rhythms that underlie motility and speech. That's a whole other story. You're also going through intermediate phases of preliminary cognition, of metaphoric thinking, of paralogical thinking. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the von der Mar's principle. It's been criticized by some writers, but I think it's an extremely important. I learned it from Silvano Arrietty, who was a friend of mine many years ago, who wrote on schizophrenic thinking. Von der Mars argued, he had to put it in syllogistic form. Mary is a virgin, I'm a virgin, ergo I'm the Virgin Mary. Or I have a beard, Christ has a beard, I'm Christ. Where, and in dream symbolism, you have a fusion of two disparate objects, let's say a knife and a phallic is a phallic symbol because of the shared features of penetration or shape. And here you have the fusion of two disparate objects, Mary and the psychotic, let's say, based on the shared feature of virginity. Or in primitive thought, Levi-Bruhl described these people who were primitive mentation. I'm criticized for saying primitive mentation, but in a way it is kind of primitive in a sense. I think it's embedded in normal thought, where they would say Akiba is swift, tigers are swift, Akiba is a tiger, or Akiba is imbued with tiger spirit. So this is a part-whole problem. I only mention it because it's another instance of whole-part, where one property or attribute or feature of an object becomes the basis for the fusion or identification of two otherwise quite different objects or subjects. And this is important in poetry, where metaphor, and in all creative thinking, where metaphor is an extremely important, and metonymy and other similar mechanisms are important. I would also say that the thing about poetry and creative work generally is that it emphasizes or accentuates this penultimate or transitional phase where the poem or the artwork or the musical idea has one foot in the mind and one foot in the world. You sense its psychic content, but there's a communicative intent. So it's midway in this process. There's also this transition from I won't go on too long, I'll give Stephen a chance here. If somebody would stop me, I warned you in the beginning. There's also a transition from timelessness to temporal order. Freud thought the unconscious was timeless. Von Hartmann, in his massive work on the philosophy of the unconscious, before Freud, said the unconscious was timeless. I don't think timeless entities exist, so I would say that the unconscious is simultaneous. And there's a whole way of thinking about dream and the narrative of the dream that taps into that. But I think the transition from simultaneity to serial order is extremely important, and something I've written about at length recently, and the relation of serial order in perception to serial order in memory to the serial order of a dream. I might have thought, actually, that, just as an aside, that the subject who reconstructs the dream, it's not clear to me, it wasn't clear to me that the images of the dream actually occurred in the order that they're reported. But then you have poetic composition like Coleridge, and you have Wagner composing his prelude to Das Rheingold in a dream, or a transitional state, 5-minute prelude, which is incredible music, recapitulating the whole ring. So it must have the same order in the dream as it's reported more or less in the morning report. Let me just divert a moment and just cite, because Steve has kind of forced me to read Ashbery, who I really didn't know anything about before this meeting. And I wanted to just cite a couple lines from him. A poem, Absolute Clearance is the title of the poem. He sees the pictures on the wall, a sample of the truth only, but one never has enough. The truth doesn't satisfy. And my interpretation of that is that when I read Ashbery, I have the impression I'm walking through a picture gallery, and I see a picture, and then I see another picture, and another picture. There's no logical connection between the pictures, but they point to a deep creative intelligence underneath. And you have this intuition that this is great poetry, but you can't really understand it in any logical way. And so here's a present, poof, another present. And I think what the artist has is the sensitivity to impressions, whether they're perceptual impressions or memories in the present, and is able to capture them in some mode of creative work. There is another aspect of microgenetic theory, which really, I should say, it's a theory of the mental state. Now, Wittgenstein famously said once that, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not sure I have it exactly right, the decisive step in the conjuring trick is to talk about mental states and events and leave their nature undecided. And philosophers do that all the time. I mean, they'll talk about a propositional attitude as a mental state, or a quality as a mental state, or an image or something as a mental state, or mental sentence as a... this is a theory of the mental state. I think it's the only theory of the mental state. And it's also a theory of how, in this development, this microgenetic development from core to surface, you go from before, after, or earlier, later time, the time of physical nature, to the establishment of a present, and the present moment, which I think is extracted in the disparity between the perceptual surface and the receding, decaying, or incompletely revived preceding states. But that's a very complicated subject to get into. But in that connection, let me just quote another statement or poem by Ashbery. This is a poem titled Fear of Death. He says, or writes, "Is there no state free from the boundary lines of before and after? The window is open today." I think it's very obvious what he's saying, that we have this present window. This is what we live in, the present bubble of the present. And that without that, it's before, after. It's the passage of physical nature. And that death is leaving the present and going into the before, after of the mindless universe. Well, I think it's mindless. Who knows? But this is his way of thinking, I think, about it, and interesting. So without the perspective, without the perspectival now, there is no human mind, really. I mean, human mind, it depends on that. And in this trajectory from the core to the surface, which is a before-after, or earlier-later succession, this lays down the past, present, future mode of time. Some of you may know the writings of McTaggart, many 100 years ago, almost, in which he described these two types of time. He concluded that time is an illusion, but I think these two ways of thinking about time can be captured in the momentary genesis of the mental state. And just a last couple of words. One of my favorite poets is Philip Larkin. And one of his poems that really I thought was just brilliant, just one line. He says, he's talking about time, he says, "This is the first thing I have understood. Time is the echo of an axe within a wood." And I thought it's just a wonderful way of capturing the knife edge of the present. William James talked about the present as a saddleback, as a kind of the fringe of the future and the past that's held together in the present. But it's the echo of an axe within a wood. So it's kind of like an illusion, it's sort of not really there. And it's the duration of the present, the 1 or 2 second duration that people have written about. There is some evidence for that in the flipping of duck-rabbit figures and other illusions, or in poetry, there's a 1 or 2 second phrase length, and even in no dramas, it's been explored by Popel in Germany and so on, 1 or 2 seconds for the present. But that's clock time. The time I'm talking about is subjective. So Steve was interested in some of the origins of this theory in poetry, but of course, you're developing a theory, you kind of look around for confirmation. You look around for philosophical confirmation or poetic confirmation. And I love to go back to Goethe, because he was writing and a friend of the German romantic idealists. And this is a kind of romantic idealist vision of the mind-brain. This is all like an image in the mind, inside the head, And he wrote, well, there are many quotes of Goethe I could use, but one of the ones that it might be appropriate to the whole part way of thinking is that he said, again, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly, he said that synthesis and analysis are the systole and diastole of life. That going from this whole to the part, analyzing the whole into its parts, he wrote this in his wonderful book on the metamorphosis of plants, how you go from a seed into the flower. He didn't know genetics, of course, but he thought it was all just parts issuing from a whole. And so I think with that kind of image, I would stop at this point and let Steve go into the poetry and see if we can figure out how that maps to this way of thinking about the mind brain.
Thank you, Jason. As you'll see, we are each of us sort of taking mostly one half of the equation and juxtaposing them, hopefully in shocking ways, and that'll encourage good questions. And I want to thank Ed and Francis for the invitation for us to speak here this evening. I'll just tell you very briefly a little bit about myself. I teach modern poetry at Washington University in St. Louis, where I specialize, or I have found myself specializing in relations between literature, philosophy, and science, especially the neurosciences. This came about mostly because I did my first work on Gertrude Stein, and published a book in 2001 called Irresistible Dictation, and discovered that in order to begin to make sense of some of her writing, I had to take seriously several factors in her growth as a human being that tended to be dismissed in most accounts. In the first place, the fact that she spent her 20s, 10 years, thinking of herself as a scientist in training, first in psychology, then at the med school at Johns Hopkins, and where she stayed for 4 years, did work on the brain, trying to map the nervous structure. And so that was one thing that sort of forced me to begin to think about what her exposure to the neuron doctrine in the late 90s might have had to do with the very peculiar experimental work that she later produced, as well as the extreme closeness she felt with William James at Harvard, with whom she studied. And later, there's this peculiar fact that emerges in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which some of you may have already read. And several times in that book, Toklas, this is an autobiography of Toklas, which Stein wrote, and it's a tour de force. And several points in the book, Toklas says, that is to say, Stein has Toklas say, that 3 times in her life, she, Toklas, had encountered what she calls genius. And in each case, when she saw the person, a bell tinkled. And so I'm interested partly in the synesthetic or the combinatory moment, but also the 3 people whom she reports having had this experience with were Stein, of course. Stein would say that. And Picasso, and that's not a great leap, although when it occurred it was a little bit of a leap. And Whitehead, whom Jason has already mentioned. And Whitehead is the odd man out here, and it led me to think fairly seriously about the summer of 1914 when Stein and Toklas were caught in England with the outbreak of war. And they happened to be staying in a country house of a couple whom they had just met, Evelyn and Alfred Whitehead. And the Whiteheads invited them to stay as long as they might until they could get back to Paris. And it turned out to be 11 weeks that they were house guests. And so, again, there's not much known about what happened there. But in fact, it's at a particularly important moment in Whitehead's career as he's beginning his transition from a fairly academic, although surprising, mathematician, having recently finished the collaboration with Russell, to becoming, 10 years later, one of, if not the leading speculative philosopher in the English-speaking world. And one thing that has been tended to have been downplayed in his change is the significance that James had for him. We won't get into detail here, but so the link with Jason occurred at a Whitehead conference in 2006, where I attended as a normal conferee attendant, and Jason was one of the keynotes. And I was intrigued by what I took to be certain resonances between his arguments about microgenesis and the kind of interstitial work that I found occurring in Stein, but also in James and in Whitehead and in several other figures. So one of those figures is Ashbery, and so I'm delighted that Jason has started reading Ashbery, and I'm trying my best with him. That is with Jason, and I can't say I'm yet in a position to be as fluent as he is about his own work, but I'm instead going to try to give you a fairly brief, although I may talk a little faster than I like, account of some Ashbery. It's a related account to what you've gotten from Jason, but it's different angle, and there'll be only the occasional mention of microgenesis, trying to just simply point out where I think there are relevant overlaps. The title of my little talk here, it's a very formal talk, it's all written out, and is Those Dreams That Are the Web on Which Our Waking Life is Painstakingly Elaborated, end quote, toward John Ashbery's microgenetic investigations. Now, several weeks ago, Francis proposed to me that he had repeatedly failed to get a handle on John Ashbery's poetry, and that he was looking forward to whatever help I might be able to supply. Well, I'm not actually going to propose a new interpretation, but instead will chiefly describe what I take to be 3 exemplary approaches to Ashbery's body of work. As you'll see, my sympathies are with the third of these, but that's not to say I wish to dismiss the other 2. They are excellent approaches. Here I'm thinking quite concretely of them as ways of approaching or moving toward the poetry, so long as one remembers that they are in fact first or second approximations rather than exact renderings. They can be characterized respectively as conveying how the poetry looks from a great distance and how it looks from very close up. If one wants a richer, more robust approximation that might enable one to begin to move with the poetry, and this is, I think, probably what Francis finds blocked this movement with, instead of continuing merely to move toward it, then one needs to take motion as well as time more seriously than the 2 initial approaches permit. And this is actually really where I think the account of temporality that Jason is working at comes into this picture. I believe the third approach does this. It is not, in fact, microgenetic, taking its model instead from complexity theory, but I want to propose a variant of this approach that would focus on microgenetic rather than complexity. Microgenesis rather than complexity. Although the 2 versions are complementary, they don't merely reproduce each other. A microgenetically based account would supplement the complexity-based account in various ways. In certain respects, the microgenetic account might in fact prove preferable because it operates at a scale, and this you'll see is a key term, closer to the poetry in question, whereas complexity theory is designed to operate at many different scales of adaptive systems. Time constraints will prevent me from making almost any specific comments about this account in microgenetic terms. I'm going to have to assume that Jason's characterization of various relations between poetry and microgenesis will enable you to grasp that feature of this account. Nevertheless, I can say that the crucial aspects include the complexity of the whole-part relation, which Jason has talked about, as well as the perplexity, as Keats put it in his Ode to a Nightingale, as to whether it was a vision or a waking dream. Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep? This sense of being perpetually in a state of waking dream, although certainly not always aware of it, is something Ashbery shares with microgenetic theory, if you'll agree with that. And he delights in alluding to Keats's lines on every possible occasion, including the title of his talk. I've taken then the title from some passages near the beginning of a book-length poem, Flowchart is its title, from 1991, a work scandalously out of print for an author who has a volume in the Library of America, which together with his best-known poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, comprises the 2 Ashbery texts I'll concentrate on in relation to 3 works of criticism. First, an essay on self-portrait by Helen Bendler called John Ashbery and the Artist of the Past. Second, John Choctaw's On the Outside Looking Out, a book-length study of Ashbery's poetry from 1956 through the 1991 Flowchart. And third, Angus Fletcher's various remarks on Flowchart in the 2004 volume, A New Theory for American Poetry. Between them, Wendler, Chaptal, and Fletcher offer exemplary instances of three alternate modes of reading, which I'll characterize for reasons that should become clear as 1, coarse-grained or structural, 2, fine-grained or textural, and 3, non-granular or scaling. Despite Fletcher's emphasis on complexity rather than microgenetic theory, his account of flowchart suggests that Ashbery's poetry lines up rather nicely with microgenetic investigations like those Jason has been conducting lo these many years. Here's what I mean when I say that Wendler's reading of self-portrait is coarse-grained or structural. Early in her essay, she proposes a general-purpose Ashberyan formula: colloquial charm plus enormous lexical range. Each of these keeps us going, keeps us reading, although at different levels. If the vocabulary surfs on waves of charm, it gives substance to the waves in turn. In effect, what Wendler has done, though not in so many words, is to attribute a sort of wave-particle structure to Ashbery's poetry. The same structure undergirds her description of self-portrait. We learn in the poem, she writes, that in 1959 in the Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum, in the company of his lover, the poet Pierre Martory, Ashbery came across Francesco Parmigianino's exquisite small round painting called Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. You'll find a representation of it on this handout. More than a decade later, in the 552-line poem of 1972, the poet, I'm still quoting Wendler, the poet reconstitutes that original 1959 experience in which a love relation, self-recognition, and aesthetic admiration were entwined, and integrates it with the information he has subsequently acquired about the portrait. The information, of course, coming in the form of particulate bits and pieces. Subsequent descriptions by Wendler, I don't have time to give them to you, display the same structure, and in doing so suggest that it is the fundamental structure of this poem. Wendler's is an appealing reading, and no doubt accurate at a sufficient remove from the nitty-gritty of the work. If it fails to do justice to the complexities of self-portrait, this is because guiding much of Wendler's reading here are models derived from the sciences of chemistry and psychology, which encourage her to overemphasize structure and subordinate or de-emphasize texture, to invoke a valuable distinction of John Crowe Ransom's. As it happens, Wendler was trained as a chemist before she turned her attention to poetry, and once you are aware of this, you discover occasional recollections, almost talismans. Thus, in referring in a preceding study to some lines of Emily Dickinson, quote, "Fire exists the first in light and then consolidates, only the chemist can disclose into what carbonates." Wendler remarks that from the carbonates the poets leave behind, we can deduce, as Dickinson asserts, the fire that was, a fire as intellectual in its light as it is passionate in its heat. Close quote. This is very satisfying and rhetorically offers a lovely and complete period, yet is only able to do so by subscribing, on the one hand, to a chemical dream of structure. Disclosure or deduction is synonymous with chemical analysis, and on the other, to a traditional psychological dualism, much critiqued these days, but still a byword where discussion of poetry is concerned, between the intellectual and the emotional, intellect and passion. The problem is that this schema leaves out the crucial mediating factor of feeling or affect, which thinkers as different as Suzanne Langer on the one hand and Brian Masumi on the other characterize as the basis of both emotion and thought, though reducible to neither. One consequence of leaving out affect, and this is very clear in Wendler's own practice, is that it predisposes one either to gravitate toward more melodramatic works or to produce more melodramatic readings. Now to turn to Chaptal, who offers readings which are not, as he puts it, close, but are textually specific, or as I rephrase this, fine-grained or textural. Rather than considering poems as such, he explains, he has chosen to examine how they misrepresent and reformulate the various systems of disclosures, texts, and practices within which they are produced. Chaptal is a superb empiricist, collecting an amazing variety of always compelling facts, and to the degree that these facts explain themselves, that is to say, self-organize in an ad hoc fashion, he is on firm ground. But when he confronts anomalies, a favorite term of Ashbury's, he notes. His method fails him. I'll supply 2 examples. First, if you'll take a look at the handout, you'll see a reproduction of Parmigianino's self-portrait from the cover of the volume which included Wendler's essay. There are additional copies here if people don't have them. It also graces the cover of Chapteau's book. I'd like to call your attention to what is in all likelihood the first object your attention has already been called to, the obvious handle that one imagines will enable one to grasp the painting. And it is here that Ashbury starts his poem. Quote, as Parmigianino did it, the right hand, bigger than the head, thrust at the viewer, and swerving easily away as though to protect what it advertises. Close quote. Due to the curvature of the convex mirror, Wendler notes, what is most obviously, quote, distorted by enlargement, greatly so, is the right hand of the painter, his creative hand, which extends itself in the foreground toward the viewer, but then curves away. Close quote. More than a decade earlier, we find that Chapteau had already called Wendler's attention to the fact that this is likely actually to be the painter's left hand, due to the usual reversal of mirror images. I say called Wendler's attention because Chapteau's study began as a doctoral dissertation, which she supervised. Here is what Chapteau has to say about the left-handedness of the hand. Quote, self-portrait begins with an obvious, though hitherto unnoticed, mistake or error or open secret. The distorted hand thrust at the viewer was not Parmigianino's right hand, but his left. What, if anything, Chapteau then asks, lies behind this misrepresentation of the portrait, this reversal of left and right? Since Ashbury makes a point, I'm still quoting Chapteau, of reminding us that everything is, quote, reversed in the accumulating mirror, this slate of hands should be related to the many reversals within the poem. Parmigianino's single and large phallic hand thrust at the viewer is sexually disorienting. It may be left or right, close quote. With the first thrust in Chapteau's account, we were told that it was not the right hand, but the left one. Now, with the second, it may be either. If Chapteau doesn't really know what to make of this finding of his, as this very variable reading suggests, nor even what to call it, Wendler knows exactly what to call the hand in question, in so confidently terming it creative, and subsequently characterizing Ashbury as a fellow creator. Wendler elides the uncertainty the painter actually registers as to whether the hand it portrays is right or left, painting hand or merely painter's hand. An over-ready identification of right hand with creative hand may give Chapteau and us some pause. What is unquestionable, though, is that nowhere in the poem does Ashbury call attention to this uncertainty. Although Chapteau remarks the ambiguity, he doesn't really examine it. If you look at and think about this painting, you'll see, it's especially clear in color reproductions, that the convex mirror is itself represented on the right-hand side, distorted like the hand, so that it is much larger than in life, and also like the hand, flattened. There's something profoundly asymmetrical about the whole experience, for try as you may, you won't be able to make the figure in the painting the exact mirror image of the figure who posed for the painting and at the same time, or at least in the same process, painted it. I'll say more on its symmetry shortly, but here I'll just observe that this inconsistency is pretty terrific, possessing the capacity as it does to blow your mind if you start worrying about it. It's also not something Ashbury has anything to say about in the painting, not at least that I've come up with. And yet he has fully prepared us to take delight in this fact, both the fact of the inconsistency and the fact that he has somehow prepared us for it without expressly mentioning it in his own poem. Chapteau is unable to do anything with the anomaly because Ashbury makes nothing of it. And it is for the same reason, no doubt, that Wendler feels that she can ignore it in her own reading. Nevertheless, she suggests its actual significance as something unmentioned in the poem, but not for that reason without effect, irrelevant, lacking meaning, in what might be characterized as her overreading of this image. Somewhat paradoxically, the fact that Ashbury doesn't make anything of the problematic of left and right in the explicit phrasing of the poem doesn't mean that nothing is made of it implicitly. In other words, though one can't point to its positive presence in the poem, it may nonetheless be said to shadow the work, much as the implicit leftness of the image of the right hand shadows and complicates Parmigianino's self-portrait. So much then for the first example of an anomaly that Chaptal notes and then drops precisely because it is so anomalous. The second example concerns a faulty end term in the double sestina that quite famously punctuates flowchart. I'll say more about that sestina with regard to Fletcher's reading of it, but for now, there are two things you need to know. In the first place, as Fletcher notes, Ashbery, quote, Ashbery uses not only a double sestina, but derives it as if in homage from an exceedingly complex double sestina of the 19th century poet Algernon Swinburne called The Complaint of Lisa. What Ashbery does is take every one of his end words from Swinburne's poem with one exception. Now, when I'm referring to end words, what I reproduced here is the final stanza plus the coda. So there are 12 stanzas and a coda. Each of the 12 stanzas, like the one here, contains the same end words, identical. The words at the end of each line are the same 12 in each stanza, but in a different order. And the order is determined, it's a set order in all sestinas because the last line in any stanza is repeated in the first line of the next stanza. So you have to cycle through all 12 lines, in all 12 end words in different order. And then in the final coda, which is a shorter, in the case of a 12-line stanza, it's a 6-line coda. The rhyme words, the end words, are repeated in the middle of each line and at the end of each line. So you have 2 per line, and you have all 12 words then cycled through the coda. Okay? So that's the basic form of this poem. And as Chaptal notes, the one exception to Ashbery taking exactly Swinburne's end words in the place where he uses them, the one exception is in the coda, which I've given you here, where, quote, Ashbery neglected to include day among the end words. So day is one of the end words, but you don't find it in the coda. And he uses the word sun twice, S-U-N. And Chaptal says by design or accident, he doesn't know, perhaps misreading Swinburne's to fly all day from sun's birth to sun's death, that's a line where Swinburne does use 2 suns and in the line. This is all that Chaptal has to say about it. And Fletcher doesn't mention it at all, yet he allows us, I believe, to say a good deal more about it. I speak of Fletcher's distinctive mode of reading, and this is the mode that I think would bear extremely interesting contrast or in comparison with microgenetic practices, as scaling instead of scalar, despite his own use of the latter term, because it might needlessly cause some confusion for those of you familiar with the physical distinction between scalars and vectors, namely between directionless numbers possessing only magnitude, those are scalars, and think of length and temperature, and quantities which possess both magnitude and direction. As I understand it, the sort of scaling that Fletcher attends to may appear to be merely a function of number, hence a scalar in the physical or mathematical sense, but is in fact a vector. And let me explain. Scaling, in other words, is a function of numbers which somehow in themselves possess direction. This may seem a puzzling notion, 8, 12, how does it possess a direction? But it is common sense where poetic numbers, meaning verse, is concerned. The trickier aspect of scale, Fletcher writes, occurs when we speak of the scale of motions, of moving masses. And it's the scale of motions, again, that seems to me at the heart of microgenetic analysis. Of moving masses as when a waterfall falls, a cloud bank rises, drifting sideways, or when some slower tectonic shift gradually flows, invisibly, but no less actually. Close quote. This, I take it, is also the pertinent scale of poetry. This is the scale in which poets write. And it is perhaps also the pertinent scale of microgenesis. Angus Fletcher adds, flowchart plays with all such motions, but as self-portrait says, not coarse, merely on another scale. In his discussion of Ashbery's poetry, Fletcher is concerned to demonstrate the usefulness of complexity theory, not so much for reading poetry as for accounting for the possibility, the in many respects unlikely eventuality of reading it at all, and by the same token, accounting for the complex functionality of works like Ashbery's flowchart. in order to interrupt the flow of reverie in a poem like Flowchart, which risks monotony in the very fact of never-ending flow, so that in itself the flow will be sensed as the idea of the poem. In other words, you won't even have this idea unless you can actually have it contrasted with something else. What's called for, and here I'm citing Fletcher, is a concentration of themes in one massively converging contrapuntal treatment. In Flowchart, Fletcher argues, this interruptive moment, and this is a moment I also would suggest where the kind of moment that you're describing, Jason, as occurring all the time in perception, comes to the surface in the poem on Fletcher's account. And so this interruptive moment is placed late in the work, allowing a gathering to occur, a settling, a domestication before the final wind-up or denouement. This takes the form of the tour de force double sestina, which famously interrupts the poem's free verse reverie. Poetry, generally, Fletcher observes, is a numerological art, and in this case, the number 6 balances any excessive accumulation of details. Note how the balance that Wendler attributes to Ashbery's undeniable charm as a writer, Fletcher locates in a mere number, not, of course, the number in itself, but in how it functions in his poem, in the complexity of its functioning, in its scaling. Here, then, is what Fletcher has to say about how such scaling operates in the present instance. So he's talking here about how this sestina, double sestina, suddenly emerging in the course of a 200-odd page poem that is written in free verse, how it actually functions within that poem to settle it in certain ways. He says, the power of the recurrence of the end words in any sestina, with the same words repeated in a different order in each stanza, clearly involves the ritual of following a rule, a ritual effect which acquires its particular power in sestinas, according to Fletcher, because the sestina form, unlike even the most complex rhyme schemes of classic English poetry, turns in on itself in an unusual way, so that every part of the sestina conspires with every other part to spread out in all directions inside the poem at large to produce a containing and environing space. What I want to suggest here is that this description of how the sestina operates in the larger poem also, it seems to me, holds for how specific cognitions and perceptions are formed according to microgenetic theory. To return to Fletcher's account, quote, the effect of repeating the 6 words, or 12 words in the case of the double sestina, is that they rhyme without being individually reshaped, unlike standard rhyme. Each time an end word is repeated, it changes shape, not in itself, but in the immediate changing dramatic context of each succeeding stanza. Again, as with the description of the sestina as serving to interrupt the flow of reverie, so this account of one's experience of the individual stanzas of the double sestina nicely segues with the account microgenetic theory offers of the momentary growth, as Jason has put it, of a given perception from an intra to an extra psychic locus, close quote. Hence, Fletcher continues, with the sestina, the rhymed words are always the same words. Their sameness, however, is perpetually transmogrified. As we hear or read the poem, the 6 or 12 end words of each stanza seem to be rhyming, seem to be changing the shape of their sense and sound. Close quote. All this can, of course, be said of any successful sestina. In addition, Fletcher observes, the sestina form has the power to intervene in the flux of sequence. It possesses, that is to say, a sort of gyroscopic power to balance larger forms, a general power that apparently derives from its particular power to turn in upon itself, thereby spreading out in all directions. Something like this already happened almost 400 years before Ashbery tried his hand at this, with Sir Philip Sidney's famous double sestina serving to settle the narrative flux of the longer work in which it was embedded. In Ashbery's case, however, the 6-fold character of the double sestina allows us to see finally that the whole 6-part meditation of Flowchart is, in fact, one immense sestina. Perfectly tuned, I'm still quoting Fletcher, perfectly tuned to reveal the point of the entire description of flow that the poem as a whole provides. The sestina anchors or gives shape to an otherwise exceedingly elusive poem. Fletcher explains the basis of this elusiveness in observing that Ashbery writes, and by extension we live in the age of the fall of parody, an age where symmetry is always eroded. This is one of Fletcher's key reference points, and in a footnote he locates the fall quite precisely. He is not the first to do so, as occurring in 1957, thus 2 years before Ashbery saw the painting, for instance, when particles were found to exist which did not display parity, the universal assumption of post-Newtonian physics, when their property of spin failed to display an equally even-handed left-right symmetry. Ashbery's poetry, Fletcher notes, is always concerned with sidewise drifting of the sort that must follow if the universe is not fundamentally symmetrical. In fact, you might say that the flowchart is an epic of sidewise drift, charting such drift on a scale that is at once epic and minute. This occurs, at least for me, most emblematically with that pesky little substitution of sun for the more correct day among the end words repeated in the double sestina. In fact, what Fletcher has demonstrated is that to the extent that we inhabit a universe of sidewise drift instead of perfect symmetry, an error like this may prove more true than a merely perfect replication of Swinburne's rhyme scheme would have been. So what I propose in concluding is that the elusiveness of Ashbery's poem may prove amenable to explanation not just by reference to complexity theory, but also somewhat closer to home by reference to microgenetic theory. Ultimately, these may not be so much be alternate explanations as complementary ones, depending on whether one chooses to derive one's explanatory model from the more general attempt, as Fletcher puts it, to broach the problem of adaptive systems, living systems, we might say, or the more specific approach of broaching the problem of microgenesis, the way, as Jason has put it, that, quote, an utterance or a perception is realized over phases which inhere in the final object, with the transition to the final object employing first dreamwork mechanism and then graded fields of conceptual and lexical semantic relations, phases that contribute the meaning of the word or that constitute, the meaning of the word or object. Thank you. So we were thinking of having a very brief exchange and then opening up the floor to any questions you might have.
Should I guess you've commented on my comments, so let me say a word or two about some things that you've said that, I don't know, or stimulate me in perhaps ways that are somewhat unexpected. The term flowchart has the effect of reminding me of the flow charts or flow diagrams of the cognitivists with their boxes and arrows and circuit boards, the open-ended concatenation and optional pathways which can be blocked or bypassed or circumvented, and so very much in contrast to the regularities. I don't know if I would speak of lawfulness. Mm-hmm. As physicists speak of the regularities of nature, and maybe reluctant to talk of the laws of nature, but there's a kind of lawfulness and regularity in microgenetic theory where there's continuous novelty. The novelty is provided by the endogenous aspect, the regularity of it provided by habit and experiential memory, and the novelty is also provided by the sensory environment, which constrains and forces the endogenous object or thought to adapt to what's out there. In terms of complexity theory, let me just say a word about for me, the problem, I'm not by any means expert in complexity theory, but the way it's been applied to the mind has been in terms of the emergence of consciousness through complexity, which is a kind of Rubicon theory. One would have to explain the occurrence of consciousness, of value, of a whole range of things suddenly when complexity reaches a certain point, and then a succession of emergences as consciousness or mind becomes more, let's say, complex. My way of thinking about complexity, it doesn't really explain what's actually happening. I don't even think emergence explains what's happening. It's just a kind of a way of thinking about explaining something that within a way that needs explaining itself. My way of thinking is that you have, and I'm here consistent with Whitehead, you have, even in elementary particles, you have a certain epoch of existence. A particle has a certain duration of existence. Whitehead said a thing, how did he put it? A thing must, to effect that the thing must complete its one cycle of its existence to be what it is. So the hypothetical atom can't be frozen at some point in the orbit of the electron. You have to have at least one complete revolution to have an atom. So in other words, you can't freeze nature at an instant, he said, something to that effect. Even a rock, he said, is a, how did he put it, is a mass of raging particles. So there's a dynamic inside every physical entity. And every entity has its epoch of existence. It has its poof, and then another poof. This is sort of Buddhist in a way, but it just generates itself and then dies and it regenerates itself. And so does the mental state. And I think within those, the duration from particles and the duration of very elementary forms of animate life, within the expanding duration and finally the duration of the mental state, complexity increases to fill the epoch. So the complexity is increasing to fill the duration of existence of the thing, whatever that thing is. It's not that the complexity is producing the change. It's the change in the extension of the duration that allows for the increase in complexity. The wave-particle distinction also reminds me of the, obviously, of the substance-process distinction. And my way of thinking about that in terms of these epochs is that the process that lays down the entity or object over the duration of its existence, over its epoch, over one moment of its being, you could say, is the becoming of the entity. And when the entity becomes, that's its being or substance. So so the becoming is the process within the thing, and the being is the thing once it's become, and then it perishes in Whiteheadian terms to be replaced by another cycle of becoming into being or process into substance. My way of thinking too is that the substance is really the category of the process within it, like a duration is a category of the instance within it. The seconds are moments within the duration. What's a duration? A duration is kind of like an arbitrary thing. What's an instant? It's an arbitrary micro duration within the larger duration. So the duration has fuzzy boundaries like categories. And I think there's some interesting similarity there that needs to be explored in more detail. But I just wanted to bring that perspective to bear on your remarks about, I don't know how germane you'll find that to be to what you've said. But in terms of the rules or regularities, I think there is a kind of, in terms of the revival of the state over the residue of the preceding state, this establishes a kind of, there's a regularity. Microgenetic theory cannot explain the content of a thought, can't explain the content of a perception. It's like psychoanalysis in that respect, although many of you might disagree. All retrodictive theories like evolution or developmental theory explain how things came into being, the past of the thing. And you take the present content and you try to explain how that came into being. You can't predict from the present content what's going to happen in the future. And that would be scientific. Science claims to be predictive. But these retrodictive theories are hermeneutic almost, because they kind of explain the origins of things. And so I can't explain why I say chair instead of table, but I can try to deal with the fact that the lexical item, word, or the chair or the item table develops out of an antecedent category of furniture, which develops out of a prior category of general objects or whatever it is. It develops out of object concepts that are still deeper and categories that are even deeper still. Like the Buddhists say, what is a chair? You have the arms and the back and the seat and the legs of the chair. What's the chair? The chair is just those things. And what is the back? The back is made up of such and such, just categories all the way down. And so microgenetic theory is kind of like that. It relates to that. And the regularities in the theory are the derivation, the process of derivation from phase to phase to phase, and its disruption or its exposure in dream or in pathology or in states of fatigue or what have you. Different moments in this process get exposed. But I think there's a regularity there. I think whole part transition is the lawfulness of the process, but there's continuous novelty. As Whitehead said, there's creativity is the generative principle of nature. Nature is continuously creative. So in a sense, to think in terms of process is to think of the mind as a garden rather than as a machine. I mean, it's a continuously growing organism that's changing, but like the child becoming the man, it changes from one moment into the other imperceptibly, but rather than one moment causing another. Actually, in microgenetic theory, you go from potential to actual. Dewey said that he talked about this shift from potential to actual, from whole to part. The decisive shift was from whole to part, or from potential to actual, into cause to effect. And microgenetic theory is not a strictly speaking causal theory, because the objects that are produced in the world don't cause other objects to do things. They are produced and they perish, and then the next world appears, and the next world appears. As in the Buddhist idea of the Brahman who opens his eyes every 20 million years or whatever, and he's dreaming the world, he opens his eyes, the world perishes, and then he goes back to sleep and a new world appears. So it's kind of like that in micro time, I think. So what do you think about that?
No, most of that it seems to me is not critical actually of what Fletcher is arguing here, but is clarificatory. That is the sense that complexity is not causative, is very much what's involved. In terms of the title, what I'd suggest is that what's going on with Ashbery's title is fairly similar to what happened with William James and the phrase specious present, where he inherited it from another thinker who's recently been identified. He was known as E.R. Clay for a long time, and now he turns out to be Robert Kelly, who's an actual person, an interesting person. And Kelly wrote a book called The Alternative, in which he coined the phrase specious present, and he meant by the specious present the knife edge present, the present which the moment you try to grasp it, you've lost it because you're now in the next moment, and so you never actually encounter the actual present, but instead that's the claim. James, in fact, then repurposed the phrase specious present to refer to a duration of the saddleback present, and so he took what was in fact a very paradoxical and reductive notion and turned it into one that was extraordinarily rich and fruitful. And it seems to me that Ashbery, in describing the flow chart here, is actually taking the cognitivist term or phrase, and then by applying it to this poem, and to a poem with this peculiar structure, which doesn't actually make sense of itself or account for itself till you're about 4/5 through the poem, and then you have this very formal extended moment. And if Fletcher's analysis is accurate, it's an extended moment, which in fact then creates a very interesting form of temporality vis-a-vis the before and after.
Was this a deliberate thing to use the term flow chart in that sense?
Well, I'm interpreting it that way.
Okay.
I haven't asked Ashbery, and I doubt he'll remember. So in any case, but I'm suggesting that the only way that title makes sense in interaction with the poem that follows it is actually to see it as a term that is being used by Ashbery, not just simply taken over automatically. It means something different in his utilization of it.
No, it's used in a dynamic sense.
Absolutely.
But again, in the cognitivist modeling, it's like describing a river in terms of a series of bricks.
And one might suggest that it ends up, and then we'll open this to the audience, but it may be more like what William James described when he said that a river is even if you describe it as with the water in the river is flowing in the form of bucketfuls and thimblefuls and spoonfuls, there's still free water flowing around it, and which is not caught in any of these devices. And I would suggest that Ashbury's flowchart here is more like that than it is like the cognitivist brick. But we can talk about that. So now, please, questions, comments.
We'd love to record your questions. So if you could step up to this microphone, if you have a question, that would be great.
And come on up. So we can capture you.
Having had the conversations that you've had between the two of you, do you think that there's anything particular about Ashbury and microgenetic theory, or microgenetic theory should apply to everything and everybody? No?
Oh, me?
Either.
Well, I must say when Steve proposed this meeting, I wasn't sure what I would be talking about because I haven't really written about poetry, and I have a paper I brought here on creativity and mysticism and published last year in terms of microgenetic thinking. So my way of thinking about poetry is the way of thinking about creative work generally. And so I'm not sure that poetry is unique in that way. So I think the theory has something to say about the creative process. I've tried to allude to that earlier. But I think poets, of course, obviously have insights that tap into some of my theoretical predispositions. So I just exploit whenever I can find a little shred of data. I mentioned Goethe because he was a friend of Hölderlin and of course was living in Jena at the time of Hegel and Kant and all these unbelievable people, and they're romantic idealists, that notion. And this theory really is an idealist philosophical way of thinking, that the world is really an image, and we're living in our little space helmets. It's a kind of schizophrenic way of thinking about the mind-brain. But I've often thought that the thing about the schizophrenic is that the schizophrenic really perceives the truth of the mental life and goes crazy from it. That our perceptions are actually our own images, our dreams, and our thoughts. We're maybe all part of the same cognitive ground, and we just sort of, like trees, we just sort of develop out of the same bedrock, so to say, of like an archetypal mind or something like that. Well, those in some of my more expansive moments, I wondered about that. But so I think in that sense, the relation between, actually, let me put it this way. Microgenesis, the term was coined by Heinz Werner, the psychologist, from the German Actualgenese, which referred to the momentary genesis of an act of thought or perception. And Werner, his work, very interesting work, but his work has fallen into disrepute, I think, because he tried to show similarities between the primitive thought in primitive cultures, thought of children, thought of the thought life of psychotics or people who were retarded, and tried to show that they all share a kind of syncretic, more primitive way of thinking. And it was a politically incorrect way of thinking about, and he didn't really explain it in the kind of you know, one of the things about work in process thinking generally in psychology has been the question of, like a theory like this, does pathology unpeel the onion skin of development? Does it sort of, is there a regression to earlier stages of development? That idea has been pretty much thrown out the window. But it's not really, you see, it's not the actualized behaviors that are replicated. It's the actual process. If you look at studies that, I mean, even Edelman's work, for example, in you know, fetal development and early development, or Sean Zhou's work and other people's work on parcellation in morphogenesis, where you have excessive development of cells and connections and then elimination of those cells and connections. You know that in a mature young macaque, a macaque monkey is mature at the age, sexually mature at the age of 6 years. Studies by Passik, for example, have shown that the macaque has lost, I think, something like 2 trillion or more than that, 2 trillion cells or connections in its brain. So the maturation involves elimination. So there is a theme here of too many cells and too many connections that are eliminated in development. And then that, I think, transits to inhibition taking the role of elimination in later life, and then whole part where you eliminate all possible routes of development except the one that's the most adaptive, where the context item or whole part transition is a kind of, you know, functional or elimination, so to say. So this I think captures a kind of basic law that runs through all of these different throughout the mental life, and that's why I've written about microgenesis as a growth process. I think cognitive process is an extension of growth. Carl Pribram has written a little bit about this in one of his works, in which he wondered whether, and he quoted early 20th century embryologists as wondering whether the pruning or the parcellation that occurs in fetal development establishes force lines that guide adult cognition. And some of you have, you've read about pruning or sculpting and so on. This is a hot topic in some neuroscience research. And I think this all is of a piece with the same way of thinking about mind-brain.
Come on up.
I have a personal, particular interest in asking the question that I'm asking, my interest having to do with the process of psychoanalysis or its peculiarities. But the question, the way I want to put the question is this. It's one thing to think about microgenesis as being mirrored, perhaps, in the creation of poetry or in the form of a poem. That's one sort of thing. But one might ask the question also, and this is the question I'm asking you, whether microgenesis explains the effect of that poetry has on a reader in contrast to ordinary discourse. For example, you've spoken about the perception restricting or confining or shaping the ultimate development of a microgenetic flow, whatever you want to call it. If that were interrupted in some fashion, if the external environment, in this case a poetic text, were somehow unusual enough in certain specific ways, would microgenesis predict or explain a different effect in that column of development? Am I unclear in my question?
No, I understand. I think there are two questions there. One is the listener or the observer of an artwork, what process goes through their mind. And I think it kind of depends. I heard a lecture by Edelman in which he was talking about Beethoven and the story of Beethoven's landlady who came up to complain to him. Herr Beethoven, you know this story? Herr Beethoven, you know, huh? You've heard it.
He told it here, but go
Oh, did he? Okay, well then I won't. No, it was a cute story about Beethoven's, if I remember it correctly, is a landlady coming up and saying, "Yeah, Beethoven, your pipes are leaking, your apartment smells, and you bang on the piano all night and you're keeping me awake." And he says, "But madam, you're my inspiration." And she says, "Inspiration? Ha 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 ha." So, the cute story. So I think, I mean, I mention it because I think that what's going on in the listener, or the reader, or the observer's mind, it can't be the same as what's going on in Beethoven's mind or Ashbery's mind, but there is a resemblance if the poem or the music is you mentioned music, Eliot, the music heard so deeply that it's not heard at all, or whatever that wonderful line was, where you just get lost in the music. If you listen to it or observe it deeply enough, then you participate, I think, in a process similar to that of the creative mind. You recreate it. That was one thing, and then the other, I mean, that would be my take on that. And then the other point had to do with, whether an interruption of this process. I think it's important to emphasize that the process can't be interrupted, because if you eliminate the object world, you're sleeping or dreaming or something like that. I mean, you have to have an object world for a conscious experience. Introspection is something that arises at a penultimate point. The images, verbal images of inner speech, or the visual images, arise at a stage antecedent to objects, which is actually an example of the evolutionary rule that new form arises from earlier, more homogeneous form building stages, not from the end point. Steve Gould put it very nicely. He said, "Evolution is a branching bush, not a ladder of progress." So new form arises from below, not at the end point of high specialization. So I think the introspective content arises in an enhancement of phases that otherwise would be given up to objects. Please.
Follow up my question, because I want to narrow it a little. If I understood you correctly, you spoke about the adaptation of a process to perception, that it's an adaptive.
Right.
Now, if what you're adapting to is something rather odd, for example, let's just say a poem is odd. It's not like it's not like an ordinary text, not like an ordinary discourse. It's not like the chairs that we're familiar with. It presents something odd. Wouldn't you expect the adaptation to that to be something to create a somewhat different process than ordinary? And I'm really wondering about that specifically in terms of a disruptive effect. But I gather from your response that that's not. You feel that it will always be, in a sense, a normal process with a normal development and a standard outcome, in which case one would wonder, why does poetry evoke anything different than any other writing or speech or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I would say that the adaptation occurs at the end point of this upward movement, where you have this massive input from in the visual cortex or the auditory cortex, where there's an adaptation to the environment that shapes the final object to realize or represent or model what's out there physically. But prior to that, it's developing along internal lines, and this is why poetry has its thought content. I mean, Ashbery, in the poem that I cited, Ashbery says here, he sees pictures on the wall, a sample of the truth only, but one that never has enough, the truth doesn't satisfy. And I think what he's alluding to, what I think he's alluding to, is that you have these underlying concepts or categories that are fractionating into the words, but you can't exhaust if you have a deep idea, it can generate a lifetime work. If you have trivial ideas, it exhausts itself and it's gone. But a strong idea can keep you busy for a life. And I think when he says the truth that can never satisfy, I think he means that you can't really fully discharge or realize the underlying category. That would be my reading of the poem, but Steve and you, others may have different interpretations, which is the beauty of poetry, that, I mean, it's being processed through your own mind. So your own experiences, your own memories, and so on are all shaping what you hear. And that the meaning of the poem is embedded in your listening to it or reading it. It's the underbelly of the perception, but it's immanent in the perception. It's not, you know, there's one way of thinking about, let's say, looking at an artwork, is that the artwork is there. It's produced, it's a physical object out there in the world, and we each bring our meanings to the object, and we attach those meanings to the object. My way of thinking is that the object has to be recreated in every act of perception, because every object that we see is an image in the mind, and it goes through this whole process. So it can traverse it very rapidly, or it can go kind of slowly and recurrently. And the other point that you bring up has to do with pathology and disruption. Now, I spent the first 10 years of my career working with aphasics, and I developed the notion that aphasic errors are really normal phases in the development of language, the momentary actualization of an utterance. These are not, it's not like you throw a hammer into a radio and the aphasic errors are the sparks that are flying out of a damaged machine. I think they have a meaning, a significance. They're not just guesses. The cognitivists would say, and this is, I've been battling this way of thinking for a long time, that, you know, errors, and here I'm in sync with psychoanalysis, because you're dealing with errors. You're trying to interpret, not errors, but you're trying to interpret what people say and how they behave. So you're not looking at what they don't do so much as what they do and trying to make sense of what they do. And Freud's insight was that neurotic symptoms are really normal but buried behaviors that are repressed or what have you. And I think in the idea that phasic symptoms, or the symptoms of brain damage, are really pre-processing phases that are suddenly brought into light or exposed, was the point that was very helpful for me to try to using errors to reconstruct the normal track or pathway of the micro-development of perceptions and thoughts and so on. So I don't think there's a truncation or interruption of the process. The process can be attenuated. I mean, a person's in coma, a person's dreaming. There's no real world out there. But I think in the schizophrenic who's thinking about strange things, his thoughts and his objects haven't adapted to the sensory environment. For some reason, I think he's not processing the sensation adequately enough, or it's not constraining the object development to realize a real world. Or let me put it a different way, he sees a real world, but the earlier phases of meaning and memory and so on are more prominent, and they distort the world that he sees or hears. That would be the way I guess I would respond to that.
Let me respond also, because I think I'd respond somewhat differently insofar as if one wants to locate a difference between what's going on in the poem and what's going on in the schizophrenic experience, that in what I would call first-rate poetry, not making any distinctions besides that, you're always going to have moments that would appear to be error of some sort or other. That is, there would appear to be a mistake, which is a form of figuration. In other words, there's something which is not, it's just said in a way that doesn't seem right. Now, when you as a reader feel that suggestive rather than somebody just making a mistake, which is, of course, what happens in a poem. You feel it's suggestive. You don't feel somebody just made a mistake here and used the wrong word when they should have used a different word. What happens is you're sinking that within, it seems to me, a larger sense that the poem as a whole makes sense of this part, which would otherwise be regarded as a mistake. And you're going to find this, I think, in all poetry at different levels. So that in the end, this is a very sharp distinction between what happened both for the reader and the writer of the poem, and what one might find in various deficit situations.